So welcome to everybody this evening to HPG's annual lecture. Welcome to our audience here in London and also our audience online. The annual lecture this year is the Global Response to Refugees and Vulnerable Migrants. And as we all know, the mass movement of populations, refugees, internally displaced people, and vulnerable migrants is driving one of the most dire humanitarian situations of our time. 1 in 113 persons is a refugee, an IDP, or an asylum seeker. And such displacement, as we all know and we hear about so often, lasts for decades. So there's been some willingness across the globe to address both the causes and the consequences of such displacement. The twin New York summits last September on refugees and on migration made some progress to wider global commitments to address this issue of displacement head-on. But however, such openness could quickly turn to isolationism as countries adopt ever more restrictive policies on refugees and as the political space for such conversation becomes more limited. So here to sort this all out for us tonight is Karen AbuZayd, who will be delivering this evening's annual lecture. A bit about Karen. She has a very long CV, which I'm going to read in its entirety. Karen is the former special advisor to last September's UN General Assembly Summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants. She has extensive United Nations experience in the humanitarian and human rights work in numerous countries. In 2011, or since 2011, she served as commissioner on the Independent Inquiry Commission on Syria. In 2005, Ms. AbuZayd was appointed Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, otherwise known as UNRWA, and served in that position in 2010, until 2010. Ms. AbuZayd worked for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees for 19 years, including as Chief of Mission in Sarajevo during the Bosnian War, as well as positions in Sudan, Namibia, and Sierra Leone. She's also served in UNHCR's Geneva headquarters, both as chef de cabinet to the High Commissioner and as regional representative to the United States and the Caribbean. Before joining UNHCR, Ms. AbuZayd lectured in political science and Islamic studies at Makerere University in Uganda and at Juba University in what was then southern Sudan. This evening, she will discuss her own impressions of what happened at the UNGA summit and also what needs to be done next to strengthen the global response to refugees and vulnerable migrants. Please join me for a warm welcome to Karen AbuZayd.
Well, thank you, Christina. And thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be among you, to be able to share with you a lot of what happened during the 10 months that I spent day and night on the issue of refugees and migrants. I'm happy to see so many old friends, too, that I didn't expect to see. Welcome all of you, too. And if there are really difficult questions on some of the legal issues, I have 2 experts here sitting in the audience to help answer. So don't be afraid to ask them. You know. We human beings have always found reasons to be on the move. And nothing we know today suggests that such movements are likely to come to an end. Many among us will continue to wish or be forced to escape conditions of conflict or poverty, or simply decide to seek better lives and living conditions. Add to these factors the looming consequences of climate change, which will become an increasingly compelling factor in forced or willful displacement. Events in 2015 were a wake-up call in many ways and in many parts of the world, as thousands of refugees and migrants were drowning in the Mediterranean Sea or dying as they attempted to cross the land route across the Sahara Desert, searching for safety or a decent livelihood. Even those who managed to reach their destinations often found they were unwelcome, regarded as burdensome strangers who would become humanitarian and political liabilities. Recognizing the breadth and the depth of what had become the preeminent crisis of 2015, the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon took the initiative to call for a global summit on addressing large movements of refugees and migrants, to be convened at the opening of the General Assembly on 19 September 2016. The UN General Assembly endorsed his proposal in a UN resolution mid-December in 2015. You know, it's the first time that migration was taken up by the summit, by the General Assembly. They'd always resisted on the basis of this being an issue of national sovereignty, so we already have to give credit that they were willing to deal with it, and in the way that they did pretty well together. In January this year, I began the assignment as a special advisor on the summit, assisted by a small team of excellent secondees from UNHCR and the UN Fund for Population Activities, UNFPA, along with part-time staff who were loaned from UN departments, particularly the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, DESA, and the International Organization for Migration, IOM, which became a related organization to the UN during the period of this last year. Our initial task was to write a report, which would serve as the basis for the negotiations with the General Assembly's 193 member states representatives to produce the outcome document for adoption at the summit in September. We were fortunate that one of our secondees, a Georgetown professor and an expert on refugee and migration issues, undertook the role of principal author of the report. An outstanding academic, she published her 10th book while we were doing the work with us. Her name is Beth Ferris. Many of you probably know of her or know her. She's also, thankfully, a very patient woman. Each of the 5 drafts of the report received 500 pages of track changes. Although we forbade track changes came in, and each time I was giving a talk one time, and I said that I was saying this was so difficult, and this lovely woman did this, and she's sitting there in the back, and 500 pages of track changes, and she dealt with them all. And she was in the back, she said, 5 times 500 pages, because each of the 5 drafts had the 500 pages. And they came in mainly from the 14 UN agencies and departments who had some responsibility for, yes, or interest in refugees or migrants. They don't obey rules in the UN, at least in the Secretariat. I think in UNHCR we used to do what we were told, no? I don't know. The drafts were discussed bi-weekly at the working level of all these 14 agencies or parts of the UN, and then monthly by the same heads of all these agencies. And at the same time, my team and I continued to consult with individual ambassadors, groups of ambassadors, 80 in all, we have input from, plus civil society organizations, academics, refugees and migrants, to feed ideas and concerns into the drafting process. 2 aspects were emphasized in all our encounters from the beginning of the exercise. And those of you who were at the Chatham House event yesterday, I've been advised I should tell you this speech was written last week. So it sounds very much, it addresses very much the issues that came up yesterday at Chatham House. So here are some of our replies. First, of these 2 things that we started out with in the beginning, the global nature of the summit. All countries, large and small, were expected to contribute to the discussion, and all could make some offer to refugees or migrants, even a single job, a single scholarship, or a family resettlement place. The commitments from the summit also would be taken up by all states, from the wealthiest to the least developed countries and the small island states. These latter were 2 of the most interesting groups that we met with, partly because the immediacy of the problems of climate change to these to groups of countries. Some are already purchasing land in neighboring countries or other countries in order to move their citizens because they have to go somewhere. The water is taking over. Second was the necessity of providing a more positive narrative around refugees and migrants, given the increasingly hostile individual, communal, regional, and national, as well as the media, treatment of surrounding the movements that are occurring, particularly those to and through Europe at that moment, which was an impetus for the summit. We had to defend that with many who said, is that why you're doing it now? It's happening in Europe, it's Middle East, or it's Syrians, or whatever. We told, this is why we emphasize the global nature. Yes, we should be glad, we should welcome this and take advantage of it. The report, which was entitled In Safety and Dignity, Addressing Large Movements of Refugees and Migrants, was completed near the end of April, and it was published by the Secretary General early in May in the 6 official UN languages. Then, consultations and engagements of various sorts, speaking engagements, continuous civil society, sponsored meetings inside the UN and outside, until it was time for the state representatives to begin to negotiate the outcome document. to be signed officially by all governments at the highest level on 19 September. And it took on the name as the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. Even that was contested, but that's what they decided it had to be. The Secretary General made that decision. We did a lot of traveling abroad to some of the capitals in different parts of the world, to Brussels, to Geneva, to Addis Ababa, and so on, to discuss with the groups of ambassadors and politicians in those areas, too. The negotiations began in late June, and they continued through 31 July, which is the cutoff date to respect August ambassadorial holidays. The exchanges were guided by two facilitators of proven competence and enormous skill, I have to say. Great kudos to them. Ambassador Donoghue of Ireland and Ambassador Carrar of Jordan. We had hoped that the permanent representatives would opt for a negotiated outcome, and we anticipated we might have to argue that. That would mean agreeing, all of them, all 193, to a consensus document that they would all sign. We were more than pleased that they brought this up themselves, unanimously, and they were stating that they wanted to agree on a document that would make a difference to the lives of refugees and migrants, and not something meaningless like some other summits, as they said, that would sit on a shelf and be forgotten or ignored. So we keep reminding them of that now. The negotiating process was fascinating, at least to those of us who were observing this process for the first time in UN New York. Both large and small differences among member states had to be overcome. The first between those most interested in refugees and those whose concerns were more about migrants. Both are groups on the move, as we know, but for different reasons, as we also know, and with different internationally agreed legal entitlements. We can talk about that. Beyond this basic challenge were many other concerns. Some governments posited the benefits newcomers brought to their countries and wished to encourage welcoming and working with them, while others leaned more toward worrying about the negatives surrounding such movements, not only for them as receiving countries, but worrying about the refugees and migrants themselves, issues around trafficking and smuggling, for example. Obvious differences, of course, were articulated between the sending and the receiving countries. Still, while most of the commitments were a result of tough, big and small picture negotiations, the 193 governments joined together by the deadline with a singular holdout on one issue finally conceded on 31 July and approved by acclamation at ambassadorial level, and this was on the 2nd of August. While lauding this consensus, there were also disappointments among those of us who had toiled over the report and saw some of the important proposals it contained weakened or diluted. A feature was noted as well by many NGOs and academics and picked up by the media. However, I think there are many commitments in the New York Declaration that we should be applauding. Some are quite far-reaching if governments actually implement them. I shall list a number of these. For example, all refugees and migrants are entitled to human rights, regardless of their status, which means even if they're illegal. Have to remember. An insistence on a human rights perspective was hovering over all the discussions throughout this time. All humanitarian appeals will be fully funded, which will require doubling current contribution levels, which are at about 49% in the best days. All of UNHCR's resettlement requests will be met, which UNHCR estimated will be about 1 million in 2017. 5% of the global refugee population. I know not the 10% that was bandied about earlier, but 5% is still a pretty big ask when we consider that only 215,000 were resettled last year in 2015. Root causes such as poverty and conflict will be seriously addressed by the global community to make movement a choice rather than a necessity. If this is respected, it'll be a huge advantage for most people who prefer not to move, not to leave their countries, and for those who bear most of the responsibility for receiving newcomers, namely those countries who are the neighbors of countries that are experiencing conflict or ravaged by poverty or natural disasters. Refugee children should be in school within a few months. We said a few days in the report, but that's a bit unrealistic when you think of the countries that have to receive the refugees and put them in schools when they don't have enough schools for their own children. So, detention of children provokes the most controversy. The proposed children should never be detained, which is a human rights precept, became children should seldom, if ever, be detained. Hardly a statement to be applauded, but even this was hotly contested till the last day, mainly by differences over the age definition for children, but others contending that detention is sometimes necessary and proper to protect the children in certain circumstances as unaccompanied minors and so on. However, more broadly and more positively, a concept of inclusion is recommended, helping newcomers to settle, to be able to contribute to their environment by learning the local language, finding a job, and offered the opportunity for additional education or learning new skills. 3 specific actions or outcomes were agreed to ensure that the commitments would be given substance and would stay alive in all countries, nationally and locally. These were 2 compacts, one for refugees and one for migrants, both to be concluded in 2018. Again, keeping a balance between the 2 groups as demanded by the permanent representatives, because the migration group understood that they had to do some work and it would take them at least a year and a half to get to the point to be able to confirm a compact. So the refugee compact was also put off till then, and UNHCR will do its work on that. The 3rd commitment was a campaign against xenophobia, launched by the Secretary General during the summit, and now led by the UN's Department of Public Information and supported by many interested actors in the public and private sectors. I'll talk a little more about that later. UNHCR is the lead on the Refugee Compact, as we all know, which will be called a Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework. So you may be seeing a CRRF acronym already around and getting more common. And they've begun work immediately to address new outflows, inflows, and significantly, probably for the first time really, seriously to identify and address protracted refugee situations, a long-neglected condition brought to our attention this last year by at least one African president who described the deplorable condition of refugees who've been living for decades in inhuman conditions in his country and suggesting that, therefore, they would be better off going home. UNHCR will be working on this proposed framework on the basis of the experiences through the next 18 months with both new and protracted movements over this whole coming year. They'll present the framework both to their executive committee and to their annual report in the General Assembly in 2018, and presenting their plans for more predictable responses based on the strongly recommended essential practice of responsibility sharing, to do one of the buzzwords around, both in and beyond the first countries of asylum. The compact itself will be discussed and developed with governments and confirmed in 2018. I'm injecting here a personal concern for those with whom I spent 10 years, the Palestinians, who have been refugees for almost 7 decades and who face even less possibility than others of moving beyond their refugee status, unless there are major efforts on the part of the politicians, Palestinians, Israelis, and others who've been unable or unwilling to confront the root causes of their refugee condition, despite the efforts exerted by the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, UNRWA. UN departments and agencies dealing with migration, including the newly associated related agency, IOM, have also begun work toward this 2018 conference on improving the governance of migration, which is the point of the conference. Some of the agencies associated with, I had to learn, were associated with migration or thought they were, are ILO, International Labor Organization. That I didn't mean that like that. Although some who were the least involved were the most vocal. The Office of the High Commissioner for Refugees, UNDP, UNHCR, of course, UNODC, the Office of Drugs and Crime, the Global Forum for Migration and Development, of course, and the Global Migration Group, HCR, of course. They are trying to bring together the many pieces of legislation and the migration procedures that are already present throughout the international system among these various agencies. The Swiss and Mexican ambassadors have been appointed as the co-facilitators, and meetings are already underway to arrange the first preparatory conference Mexico has volunteered to have it. I don't know if it's been agreed, but there will be one fairly soon. And to begin the process of document preparation and consultations on the compact. The migration meeting in Dhaka next week in Bangladesh will be the first time when we'll all get to also refer to the summit and how it's going to be helping toward new things, toward this series of migration conferences that have taken place. I've focused on the process toward and the conclusions of the summit, both because this was the suggested topic for this evening, and since it had occupied me day and night for 10 months, but also because I found it important to share with you how challenging, as well as enlightening, it is to observe 193 government representatives working, often in formal or informal, geographic and thematic groups, to come together to agree by consensus, not a majority, mind you, everyone had to sign, on a range of commitments intended to assist those among us who are on the move and in need, especially when some of the proposed actions are not immediately obvious to or indeed welcomed by all of the 193. I believe the document of the adoption of the New York Declaration was also noteworthy given the political climate in many parts of the world, I could say most. The fears, some understandable, that both policymakers and individuals raise about certain groups on the move, the turning inward against the other, the stranger, by politicians and ordinary citizens, perhaps demonstrated, at least to me, most blatantly and frighteningly in my view, by the results of the American elections last month. More important, though, is whether governments will live up to the commitments made, whether they believe in and embrace them sincerely enough to implement them, to make provisions, including legal ones, which will win the approval of these citizens, their citizens, to accept and welcome both those fleeing persecution and conflict and those seeking a better life for themselves and their families. The campaign of the Secretary General, that's anti-xenophobia, that some said sounded exclusive, is actually inclusive because its brand is together, respect, safety, and dignity, words taken from the title of the report. And it's designed to promote acceptance of the other, to demonstrate the value of getting to know and appreciate strangers, particularly those coming from unfortunate circumstances. Such encounters and exchanges are a proven recipe for changing people's minds and attitudes toward refugees and migrations. If you have a chance, you can see the island of All Together, where two young filmmakers on one of the Greek islands were putting together, with people's agreement, a refugee or a migrant who was on the island with a local person or a tourist, a refugee, a tourist, yeah, a migrant, tourist, they're all migrants, and having them sit on a bench and talk to one another, and they'd, be looking at each other strangely at first. By the end of their conversation, they were exchanging emails and telephone numbers and say, you're just like us. They really say that. We make that up, but it's there. It was really wonderful. The UN information centers in cities all around the world are leading the campaign, using social media and recruiting advertising agencies who are competing to be the one to be associated with this program. We have the agencies come into the Department of Public Information to support different parts of what the UN is trying to do. And so we were glad that there were 5 or 6 agencies that we had to choose from to take on this campaign. They're working also with exemplary governments, if I could name Canada, Germany, and Uganda, and interested in legal, eager civil society, faith-based organizations to bring audiences on board with the concept and the benefits of diversity. We know that not everybody likes diversity, so we have to convince them it's a good thing. Can we do this? The answer is yes to can, but the more relevant question is, will we do it? We in the UN, civil society, academics, and our local and national governments work together to ensure that the world becomes a better place for refugees and migrants? Are we too immersed in an era of suspicion and distrust, of imagining that there are too few goods for too many people? Are there too few leaders like Angela Merkel and Yoweri Museveni and Justin Trudeau who understand the benefits and even the necessity of welcoming refugees and migrants? Many countries need them. They have aging populations. They have jobs that need to be taken. They need people to come in. How and what can we learn from Canada, where there are many more communities and families asking to sponsor refugees than there are refugees available to be sponsored? I think this came up yesterday in Chatham House yesterday, and we got a good briefing on this from the Canadian representative who was there. I may be unduly influenced right now at this moment by my own post-election surroundings, since it appears that many of my fellow citizens are among others around the world feeling not only that they're losing out, but they're losing out to distant and intrusive strangers. We see similar sentiments expressed by senior members of governments in some countries who are worried about becoming less white or less Christian and so on. We have to deal with these things. We see similar sentiments expressed by senior members of government and decisions made on the basis of real or anticipated election results, decisions which are the antithesis of what the Summit on Refugees and Migrants is purporting to achieve. Will the interest aroused by the summit, which was considerable at the time, be sustained sufficiently to ensure that refugees will begin to be or again be seen in a more positive light? Will and can they be welcomed beyond the first country of asylum? Those waiting sometimes for years in Greece and Italy, in Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, Iran and Afghanistan, Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, all of these are countries which have most recently set fairly good examples of accepting those seeking asylum. Will the asylum seekers be able to move on in a manner which ensures that the responsibility for hosting refugees is shared in the neighborhood as well as around the world? Are we able to move from the global, which we insisted upon as we began this journey toward a global summit, to the local, where in fact the pro-movement movement has to be grounded? Ordinary people, the majority, need to be convinced and in turn demonstrate to their leaders that they accept and welcome newcomers, those with different customs, different languages, and different appearances. Leaders play, of course, an essential role in shaping the public narrative, but citizen influence is crucial in contributing to that narrative. When citizens and policymakers share the same vision, decisions result in actions that allow all of us to enjoy the rights and privileges that are available in some parts of the world only to a few. Encouragingly, the September summit was not alone in spreading the humanitarian message over this past year. Conferences early in the year produced pledges for millions of dollars for Syrian refugees and where settlement was the focus. The World Humanitarian Summit took place in June. Hans Jorg is here, isn't he? Where hundreds of attendees from all walks of life gathered to exchange ideas on deepening and widening the humanitarian message and humanitarian action. And the UN Summit, of course, was followed on the following day by the Leaders Summit, called by President Obama and co-chaired by the Secretary General and a few other states. It led to pledges that reconfirmed and substantiated many of the needs discussed and agreed the previous day at the UN Summit. The Holy Father himself has weighed on this repeatedly on these issues, most recently decrying the polarization seen around the world. So I'll close with another one of our messages throughout the negotiations, which was that no single entity can address the refugee and migrant movements alone, be it a geographic, humanitarian, developmental, or a political body. We must work with neighboring countries and communities, with civil society and political institutions. This is a list I keep repeating: academics, the private sector, refugees and migrants themselves, and the media, to ensure that positive attention is paid to issues that are not going to disappear. We must spread the Secretary General's campaign demand, and I repeat this too, together, respect, safety, and dignity for refugees and migrants. I've offered many questions and made a few demands, and I'm eager to hear your questions and comments, ideas and advice, particularly about how to move forward toward the goal of improving the lives of those on the move, both globally and locally, believing that we can, together, achieve results that benefit us all. I thank you. Bad knee that's about to be replaced, and it doesn't like to sit down, so that's why I'm standing up.
No, we almost lost Karen. parent to knee replacement. So we're exceptionally grateful that you're here, standing or seated. Listen, I know I speak on behalf of everybody in this room and everybody online to say thank you for this. Thank you for highlighting what was difficult about this process, highlighting both the positives that came out of this process, and also for your personal reflections and candor about, what we can do and what will be, much more difficult to do. I think, this idea, we all talk about this doom and gloom scenarios that we're always painting. It's good to hear that someone like you, who has witnessed all of this from behind the scenes, has some optimism that we actually can do this. It's a matter of will. Will we do this? And that's a matter of largely a political will. I'd just like to bring up two images that you left us with. One is that we need to change the narrative from the distant and intrusive strangers to the island of all together. And I think that's a nice thing to be able to picture as we have this discussion. But anyway, I'd like to open the floor now to questions. I think I'll start here in London because you're all sitting here in front of me, and then I'll move online once we've exhausted a set of questions here, and I'll take a few to start with. If I can ask you guys, excuse me, to speak into the microphone so that our online audience can hear, that would be great. So just wait for a microphone. Ambassador Hisham, could you please start?